Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. It really did come down to that.
I'm Deborah Kane, Vice President of Food and Farms at EcoTrust and publisher of Edible Portland. I'm here today with best-selling author Michael Pollan to talk about his new book, In Defense of Food, An Eater's Manifesto. So Michael, I thought I'd start our conversation off today by putting you smack dab in the middle of an argument that I'm having with my husband.
Okay.
Okay? So my husband, who I love very much.
Let's stipulate this.
Yes. He has decided to change careers, and he is now in nursing school, which means that he's been taking some nutrition classes. And the other piece of the story that's important is that we have 2 young children at home whose favorite food group is white bread with butter. So the other day, my husband
You're lucky. In my case, it was just white bread.
Just white bread?
The butter had something.
So you're already on my side. So the other day, my husband comes home from the grocery store, and he announces that from henceforth, we will be spreading on the children's white bread not butter, but rather this butter-like substance, this thing that tastes like butter. It literally says that on the package. And I thought to myself, what in the world, what has happened, A, to my husband, and B, to my kitchen? You know, I rule the roost in the kitchen, so how could this be happening? So I'm curious your perspective on what he might have learned in this nutrition class that would make him think that henceforth we should be spreading butter-like substance on our white bread.
Well, he probably learned that saturated fat is the great dietary evil, animal fats, which has been, you know, kind of the mainstream opinion in nutrition circles for 30, 40 years. The interesting thing is, though, that idea is kind of losing favor, and the scientists are revisiting it. Nobody's prepared to declare saturated fat a health food, but the alternatives to it, such as margarine, have turned out to be a lot more lethal than saturated fat. Now they've reformulated margarine. Margarine is the most fungible of processed foods, because whatever the current nutritional theories are, you can re-engineer your product to reflect that. So say now if omega-3s are the good fat, you can get those into your margarine, and you can take out the hydrogenated fats, and it looks like this is not hydrogenated. But this reflects a moment in our understanding of diet that will pass.
Thank goodness.
And butter has worked for people for a really long time, and I've from what I've seen of nutritional history, I'm kind of a reactionary, and things that have worked for a long time are probably the best things to eat. Now, you don't eat a lot of butter, but butter is food. Butter is real food,
well,
and this is an edible food-like substance. And in general, I think we should eat food.
That was exactly my response, and that was the one thing I thought butter had in its favor was the fact that one could call it food, and with a great deal of confidence.
Not an edible spread. The modern history of nutritionism that I want to talk about for a minute really begins in the 1970s. This is the world of food that we are stuck with, and that we are trying to escape, and that I'm hoping to help you escape. There's a couple red-letter days in the triumph of nutritionism in America, and some of them you will remember, and some of them you won't. One is, in 1973, a very obscure thing happens in the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. There had been a very interesting law in America since 1938 with the founding of the Food and Drug Administration. It was called the Imitation Rule. And this rule held that if you had a traditional food like bread or pasta or yogurt or sour cream, and you changed the recipe significantly, and you added things, and you replaced things that you expected to find there with other things you didn't expect to find there, you couldn't call it bread or pasta or sour cream. You had to call it imitation bread, or imitation sour cream, or imitation yogurt. This really troubled the food industry because they had some ideas on how to improve on these traditional foods. And in fact, it troubled the public health community, which was very concerned about our fat intake and was very enamored of the idea of re-engineering foods to have less fat. So with the help of the American Heart Association and some other groups, the food industry goes to the FDA and petitions them and lobbies them and spends a fortune getting them to throw out the imitation rule, which they very quietly do in 1973. Now, if you attach the word imitation to a food, you can't sell it. I mean, think about it. We have this thing called low-carb pasta, okay? Some of you may have actually tried it. What if it was called imitation low-carb pasta or low-carb imitation pasta? You wouldn't ever buy it. So it was very important to get this word out of the marketplace, and they succeeded. And this opens the floodgates to all these re-engineered products, to these wonders like no-fat sour cream. There is no cream in no-fat sour cream. The word should not be allowed on that label. It's something else. You might like it, you might think it's good for you, but let's not call it sour cream. Well, we do call it sour cream. And read the ingredients on no-fat sour cream, and you will be stunned. It has nothing to do with sour cream. It's an image, it's an idea of sour cream in someone's eyes. It's like I have 3 sisters who are all vegetarians, and they love all those, you know, tofu bacon and tofu this, and they haven't had meat in like 10 or 20 years, and they'll prepare some of this tofu bacon, and they'll say, "Isn't it amazing how much it tastes like bacon?" It doesn't taste like bacon. This is an image in their heads. Well, that's no-fat sour cream. So the imitation rule, the repeal of the imitation rule, which, by the way, if there are any public interest lawyers in the room, if you listen to what I was saying, you realize that this was completely illegitimate. The FDA threw out a law of Congress. Okay? The law in Congress was not changed. Somebody could sue to bring back the imitation rule. And it would be a wonderful thing if they did. And all that low-fat stuff would disappear. So that's one red letter day. The next red letter day in the rise of nutritionism comes in 1977. And that is when Senator George McGovern, chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition, decides that he wants to do something about the epidemic of heart disease in America. And he holds a bunch of hearings, and the consensus sort of seems to be that animal fat is the problem. And so he decides that we need a set of dietary goals for the United States, something we'd never had before. The government had never endeavored to pronounce on food for everybody. They had pronounced on food for people with certain deficiencies, people with certain diseases, but this time the idea was change the way we all eat. And the dietary goals were announced in 1977, and they included this sentence: eat less red meat. This was a very controversial thing, as it turns out, for a senator, for a select committee on nutrition to say. And McGovern received a firestorm of criticism from, guess who? The cattlemen, who happened to live in the state. There were a bunch of ranchers, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the grocery manufacturers. Everybody jumped on McGovern's committee. You can't say eat less of anything. That will hurt industry. So McGovern was actually forced to rewrite his recommendations, to negotiate them with the industry. And this is a key turning point in the whole American discussion about food. So remember those words, eat less red meat. Okay, you understand what they say, right? It's pretty clear. It's normal English. For government, it's remarkably clear. He changes this to choose meats that will reduce your saturated fat intake. Brilliant compromise. No one knows what they're talking about. Note a couple of things about this, though. It's in the affirmative. Choose meats, okay? The industry can get behind this. We're saying eat more. Keep eating. Don't, the word less is nowhere there. And it's phrased in the language of not foods, not meat, but saturated fat, a nutrient. And this, with that compromise, became the accepted way to talk about food, for the government to talk about food. And look as hard as you can, and you will not find the government ever telling people to eat less of anything since then. Not allowed, bad for business. And you will find that the entire language is about nutrients. And from that day forward, that became the official language. We get recommendations about saturated fat, and we get recommendations about fiber, and we get recommendations about grains, but we don't get recommendations about actual things that people understand called foods.